Well, welcome to our discussion of Chapter 2 topics from the textbook. These are focused mainly on the external environment and how it affects the financial planning process. The topics are fairly well outlined in the textbook, so we're not going to go through every single item from the text because I find that to be essentially a duplication of what you're expected to do by reading the textbook. We're going to fill in some of the blanks, add a little bit to what's discussed in the textbook, but it really comes down to 6 broad areas: economic factors, legal factors, social factors, technological factors, political, and tax factors. And in each one of these areas, there can be opportunities or threats to an individual and their financial situation. So these are all things that a planner and the individual client need to be aware of, because changes in any of these areas can change an opportunity into a threat or vice versa. And being aware of your surroundings and the environment in which you're essentially forced to live your life, your financial life in particular, will enable you to navigate those waters more successfully. So graphically, this is really what we're looking at. We've got what's called the internal environment, which are client-specific items that we'll talk about later on, and the external environment that essentially surrounds everything, or you can think of it maybe as a giant pool that the client is swimming in and is affecting their every movement. We analyze these things because any particular events that come up, law changes, taxation changes, changes in overall societal values, will have an effect on the way people live, work, spend, save, and reason, and thus have a direct influence, and this is an absolute direct influence on their personal financial decision-making processes. I mentioned that I'm not going to go through every single item in the textbook in this chapter, and this essentially is a summary list of those things that I would expect that just from a simple reading of the text that you would gain a basic understanding of these areas. We're not going to delve into any of these things on a very complicated basis, but you should have gained some understanding of the ramifications into the financial planning process in each of these particular areas. So I'll expect you to have identified all of these areas, or not identified them, but at least read through all of these from the textbook. And if you have any questions, certainly let me know. But otherwise, I will assume that you were able to gain everything that you need just from the readings. I'm going to focus on a couple of areas instead that might seem basic to some people, but may very well, you might be one of the large group of people that I find have a basic misunderstanding of how a couple things work. So let's talk about some general economic principles here. Of course, in a market economy, supply and demand are at the root of our discussions of economics, and so we're going to have a little discussion there, but I think there's some confusion as to what exactly is going on in this arena of supply and demand. We'll talk a bit about substitutions and complements, and very little on elasticity, but equilibrium is a key concept here. So let's start first by looking at the demand curve. So on the demand curve, we plot, this is the same on the supply curve as well. We plot price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis, and here we're talking about quantity demanded. And as you can see here on a typical demand curve, as the price goes down, the quantity demanded increases, and that's what generates the shape of a typical demand curve. And most people can understand that from their basic business or econ classes. But what we do need to discuss appropriately on this slide is this concept of price elasticity. Price elasticity essentially generally is referring to how this demand curve essentially looks. So the relationship between price and quantity for certain types of things, there's a very indirect relationship, I guess, and for other things, a small change in price has a tremendous effect on the quantity. And in that arena, we're talking about elasticity. The quick way to remember this, if you want to think of the extreme case, when something is perfectly price inelastic, it essentially forms a demand curve that looks like this. The demand curve would be perfectly straight up and down, meaning that as price goes up and down, the quantity remains unchanged. That means that the demand is inelastic. It does not change at all for a given change in pricing. Over here, this typical demand curve has a fairly elastic description because there's fairly significant changes in, especially down here, the more horizontal the line becomes down in this area, the more elastic we describe the price quantity relationship to be, in that as the price goes down when you're down here, the quantity increases quite substantially. So there's certain things like basic goods, food, for instance, not eating out at a restaurant, but the bare necessities are going to be fairly inelastic in their behavior because as the price goes up and down, the demand really doesn't change a whole lot, the quantity demanded. But other things like luxury goods or eating out at fancy restaurants, that sort of thing, are going to be quite elastic. So hopefully that, if you didn't know those terms before, this adds a little bit of clarity. The supply curve is a different shape. It's upward sloping like this, implying that as the price essentially goes up for something, the quantity that suppliers will be willing to produce goes up, shifts over to the right, which would make sense if you're in the business of making a widget or anything else. If the price in the economy, the price that people are willing to pay goes up, you're going to be enticed to produce more of that item because there's a lot of profits to be had there. Where things get a little more complicated is when we describe the relationship between these two things. So first we need to understand a couple of concepts. The concept of substitutes in the economy. Substitutes are, chicken and turkey, for instance, assuming you're not a vegetarian, that if someone enjoys chicken, turkey is quite a good substitute or alternative because it's similar. And if, for instance, chicken becomes extremely expensive, people will tend to substitute it with turkey if it's relatively less expensive, and vice versa. Complements, on the other hand, we're not substituting one for the other. We are buying things that complement one another. Peanut butter and jelly, the classic complements here, where if people's consumption of jelly increases because they tend to like to eat peanut butter with the jelly, we'll tend to see peanut butter consumption also increase. Now, how does that affect this relationship between supply and demand? Well, first let's talk about equilibrium. So if we were to plot the supply and demand curves for a certain product together, you can see that they intersect, and that intersection point is called the equilibrium point. And in a market economy like what we have, you will tend to see the price and quantity settle at this equilibrium point. If the price is higher than that, it will tend to be driven down to the equilibrium point. If the price is lower than this, we will see essentially there's forces at work that are directing the actual price in the economy and quantity to be at that equilibrium point. But this relationship can change a couple of different ways. First of all, we can, from just the demand curve, for instance, we already discussed where if prices change, go up and down, our quantity demanded goes up and down. I think where a lot of confusion comes in is the difference between a quantity demanded shifting and the demand curve itself shifting. What I mean by that is this curve can actually at times shift one way or the other, which would of course cause that equilibrium point to move to a different point. The easy way to remember about what types of things cause changes in quantity demanded versus a change in the demand curve itself, if the driving force is one of the labels on the axis, either the price, let's talk about peanut butter. Okay? Peanut butter itself. If the price of peanut butter goes up, the quantity of peanut butter demanded will go down as we follow along this demand curve. So if it's the price that's changing of peanut butter, or the quantity demanded, that is movement along the line. If it's a shift in the demand curve itself, that is going to be not from a change in one of these variables, but rather a change in something else. If it's something other than what's on this graph that's causing the demand to change, that's a shift in the line. What I mean by that, let's say that people's incomes, disposable income, drops in half. There's some, I'm not going to try to describe why that might happen, but let's pretend there's a drop in people's income, significant drop. Well, that's going to essentially cause the quantity of peanut butter demanded at any price to go down. So we would describe that as a shift in the demand curve, and in this case to the left. Because people have less money, they're just going to buy less peanut butter or other things. If it's a change in just the price of peanut butter, that was just movement along the line. But what I've described here is an outside force, something other than the price or quantity of peanut butter itself changing, that will cause this shift. Here's an area where complements and substitutes play a large role. We talked about peanut butter and jelly being complements. If the cost of jelly were to go down, so if jelly cost goes down, how do we think that's going to affect peanut butter? Well, if the cost of jelly goes down, the quantity of jelly demanded goes up. We've already established that. Well, if people are buying more jelly, what are they going to do with a complement? Well, they're going to buy more of it, because the more jelly you have in the pantry, the more peanut butter you're going to have. So the price of jelly would cause a shift in the demand curve of peanut butter. So this is peanut butter here. And we would see a new line maybe right here. Now you can see what this has done. This has caused the equilibrium point to move from here to here. And we would see the economy react in exactly that way. It may not be instantaneous, but you'd be surprised at how quickly things alter to these kinds of forces in a fairly open market-based economy. So the key takeaway here is understand the difference between a move along the supplier-demand line. Okay, if it's moving along the line, it's either the price of the item or the quantity of the item changing. If it's a shift, and there's a lot of ink on here, so let me erase that. If it's a shift one way or the other of either of these lines, it's something other than the price or quantity of this case, peanut butter. That's how you remember the difference. And hopefully that will clarify, maybe not just for this class, but for other instances where you're dealing with some basic economics.